There was a time when Harley-Davidson owned the road. You heard that V-twin before you saw it, and somehow the whole street knew what was coming. Riders turned their heads, dealers had waiting lists. Owning one meant you had finally made it into a different class of motorcycling. But that kind of power does not last forever. Somewhere along the way, the sound stayed, but the weight behind it started to fade. Today, we are looking back at the era when Harley-Davidson felt untouchable. And stay with me until the end, because the reason that era disappeared says more about riding today than most people want to admit. The dream bike. You didn't just end up with one sitting in your garage. You worked your way toward it. Years of riding, saving, watching, waiting. Then one day, it was yours. That moment didn't feel casual. It felt like you crossed into something most people never reach. You didn't need to say anything. The bike said it for you. Pulling it into your garage changed how you saw everything around you. The same space looked different. The same tools meant something else. It wasn't about chrome or paint. It was about what it took to get there. People chase that kind of feeling in other ways, usually with machines they never actually own. This one was real. You could ride it, maintain it, live with it. Out on the road, you noticed something right away. People treated you differently. Not because you demanded it, but because they recognized what they were looking at. It wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a signal. You had arrived at a point others were still aiming for. That understanding didn't need explanation. It was already built into the culture. Plenty of riders spent years saying, "One day." That phrase carried weight back then. It meant something specific. It meant you hadn't reached it yet, but you knew exactly what it looked like when you did. And once you got there, the goal shifted. It wasn't about wanting anymore. It was about belonging to something you had already earned. That sense of arrival didn't come from a brochure or a sales pitch. It came from something far more visible and far more real. That V-twin sound. You didn't need to see it first. You heard it coming down the street long before it reached you. That low, steady rhythm carried through traffic, across intersections, past storefronts. It didn't sound forced. It didn't sound like it was trying to get attention. It just existed, and people reacted to it without thinking. Heads turned automatically. Conversations paused for a second. Not because something loud passed by, but because something recognizable did. You could watch it happen from a distance. A rider would roll through at a steady pace, not doing anything dramatic. And still, the entire street would shift around that moment. The way it moved mattered just as much as the way it sounded. Smooth, controlled, deliberate. No rushing, no proving anything. That presence didn't come from speed or noise alone. It came from how everything about the bike worked together. The posture, the stance, the way it held the lane. It looked like it belonged there more than anything else on the road. You didn't need to be riding one to notice it. Anyone paying attention could see the difference. It wasn't subtle. Once you recognized it, you started seeing it everywhere. Same reaction, same shift in the environment, same quiet acknowledgement that something different just passed through. After a while, it stopped feeling like coincidence. It felt like a pattern. If this sounds familiar from your own riding years, take a second to like this video, subscribe for more real rider stories, and share your experience below. The story everyone repeats. Spend enough time around riders and you start hearing the same thing over and over. Not word for word, but close enough. One brand owned the road. Everything else was just there. It didn't matter what someone else rode. The conversation always circled back to the same point eventually. That idea didn't need to be pushed. It spread on its own. Riders talked about it at gas stations, at diners, during long stops on the side of the road. It showed up in small comments and quick comparisons. Someone would mention a different bike, and the response was almost automatic. Yeah, but it's not the same. For a lot of people, that belief shaped how they planned their next move. If they didn't have one yet, they already knew where they were headed. It wasn't a question of if. It was a question of when. You'd hear it in the way they talked about future rides, future trips, future plans. Everything pointed in one direction. The more it got repeated, the more it settled in as fact, not something to debate, not something to break down, just something you accepted as part of riding itself. It became part of how people understood the road, even if they couldn't fully explain why. Once you step past what people said and look closer, a different picture starts to form. Beyond the road. You started seeing it in places that had nothing to do with your daily ride. On screen, in scenes that had nothing to do with commuting or weekend trips, it still showed up the same way. One appearance, and you knew exactly what it meant. No explanation needed. It carried its own message. In films, it wasn't just a prop. It was part of the identity of whoever wrote it. You could take one look and understand the role it played. That kind of recognition doesn't happen by accident. It builds over time through repetition and consistency until it becomes automatic. It didn't stop there. Music picked it up too. Not in a technical sense, not in a breakdown of engines or parts, but in what it represented. Freedom, rebellion, movement. The same ideas that lived on the road showed up in lyrics and visuals, reaching people who had never even sat on a bike. Beyond the United States, the meaning only grew stronger. In parts of Asia, it wasn't just respected, it was the dream. Riders didn't just want a motorcycle, they wanted entry into something bigger. Owning one meant stepping into a different level entirely, one that felt distant until it suddenly wasn't. That's when it becomes clear. What people saw on the surface was only part of the story. The image had already traveled further than the machines themselves. Something deeper was building underneath all of it, and that's where the real story begins. Sold before arrival? You didn't walk into a dealership, point at a bike, and ride out the same afternoon. It didn't work like that. You showed up, talked to someone behind the counter, and most of the time, you heard the same thing. Nothing available. Or maybe one coming in, but it already had a name on it. If you were serious, you put your name down and waited. Bikes disappeared before they even touched the floor. Pre-orders cleared inventory before anyone else had a chance to see it in person. Dealers didn't need to convince anyone. The interest was already there, lined up ahead of time. You weren't negotiating price as much as you were trying to secure a spot. That alone told you what kind of demand you were dealing with. Waiting became part of the process. Weeks turned into months, depending on the model and the timing. You checked in, stayed in contact, made sure your place didn't slip. There was no guarantee, just a sequence you followed and hoped lined up in your favor. Getting one came down to timing, patience, and sometimes a bit of luck. When the call finally came, it wasn't a casual pickup. You showed up knowing you had already put in the time. That moment felt earned because it was. You weren't one of many browsing options. You were one of the few who made it through the line and ended up with the keys. Ownership didn't end at the sale. It pulled you into something with structure behind it. The badge brotherhood. Once you had one, you started noticing how organized everything was around it. These weren't random riders meeting up on a weekend. There were established groups, clear identities, and expectations that came with them. You didn't just show up anywhere and blend in. You knew where you fit and who you were riding with. Patches, signs, and small details told you what you needed to know. You could look at a group and understand how they operated without anyone explaining it. There was a system in place that most people outside of it never really saw. Riders knew who rode where, who organized what, and how things were done. Meetups followed patterns. Same places, same schedules, same faces showing up regularly. You didn't have to guess where people would be. It became predictable in a way that made it easier to stay connected. That consistency wasn't accidental. It came from structure, not spontaneity. That structure extended beyond just riding. It shaped how people interacted, how they planned trips, and how they represented themselves on the road. You carried that identity with you, whether you were riding alone or with a group. It wasn't something you turned on and off. It stayed with you. Over time, what started as individual groups expanded into something much larger: rally towns. Riding didn't stay limited to small groups or short routes. It scaled into events that took over entire areas. You didn't just plan a ride, you planned around destinations that were already known for drawing riders in. Those events weren't hidden. Everyone knew when they were happening and where to go. When you got there, the difference was immediate. Streets filled with bikes instead of cars. Parking lots packed with machines lined up in every direction. Gas stations, diners, and motels all adjusted to handle the flow. You weren't part of a small gathering. You were part of something that reshaped the environment for a few days. The same roads, the same stops, the same routines repeated year after year. You saw familiar faces without needing introductions. People came back because they knew what to expect. That kind of consistency made it easier to keep showing up. It became part of how you scheduled your time. It went beyond riding itself. It influenced where you stayed, where you ate, and who you met. The event wasn't just a ride, it was a temporary shift in how everything around you operated. For that period, the entire place moved to a different rhythm. That kind of scale didn't happen without a reason behind it. The global dream. Outside the United States, the picture looked different. What felt familiar at home stood out in a much bigger way overseas. In parts of Asia, seeing one on the road wasn't common. It caught attention immediately, not because it was new, but because it represented something people recognized from afar. Owning one wasn't just about riding, it was about stepping into a different level of access. Riders followed what was happening from a distance, learning about the culture before they ever had a chance to be part of it. The bike became a gateway into something they had been watching for years. Getting one meant more than a purchase. It meant entry. You weren't just adding a machine to your garage. You were connecting to a system that existed far beyond your immediate surroundings. That connection carried weight, especially in places where the opportunity to own one wasn't as straightforward. The idea of it traveled further than the machines themselves. People understood what it meant before they ever heard one in person. That recognition built over time, spreading through media, stories, and word of mouth. By the time someone finally got one, they already knew what it represented. From that point forward, the story doesn't stay steady. A shift begins, and it doesn't announce itself right away. The first slowdown. At some point, you walked into a dealership and noticed something that hadn't been there before. Bikes were sitting, not just one or two tucked in a corner, but several lined up without tags already tied to them. You didn't need to ask if they were available, you could tell just by looking. The urgency that used to define the buying experience wasn't there anymore. You weren't hearing the same conversations about waiting lists or upcoming deliveries already spoken for. Instead, there was time to look, time to think, time to compare. That shift didn't feel dramatic in the moment, but it stood out because it broke a pattern that had been consistent for years. You could take a step back, walk around the bike, even come back another day, and expect it to still be there. That hadn't been normal before. Availability changed the dynamic completely. It moved the experience from securing something rare to choosing something accessible. Dealers adjusted quietly. They didn't announce it, but you could see it in how they talked, how they approached buyers, how they handled inventory. The pressure moved from the rider trying to get a bike to the dealer trying to move one. It wasn't sudden and it wasn't loud, but it was there. When something that used to disappear instantly starts staying put, it usually points to something shifting underneath the surface. When the price stopped making sense. There was always a cost attached, and that never surprised anyone. What changed was how that cost felt when you started comparing it to everything else. Wanting one stayed the same, but justifying it started to take more thought. Riders began to look at the numbers differently. You didn't just consider the purchase anymore. You looked at maintenance, insurance, parts, and long-term use. It became less about reaching a goal and more about deciding if it still fit into everything else you had going on. That kind of thinking slowed things down. The gap between the idea of owning one and the reality of keeping one grew wider. Not because the bike lost its appeal, but because other priorities started competing for the same space. Time, money, and practicality all entered the conversation in ways they hadn't before. It wasn't a rejection, it was a recalculation. Riders who once moved forward without hesitation started pausing, running through the numbers, and weighing their options. That pause didn't eliminate demand, but it changed how quickly decisions were made. At the same time, another pattern began to break, and it had nothing to do with pricing alone. If you want more straight, no BS breakdowns like this, make sure you subscribe. This channel is built for riders who value truth, history, and what really matters on the road. There's more coming that you won't want to miss. New riders changed. For a long time, the path felt predictable. Riders came up through the same progression, aiming toward the same endpoint. That flow kept everything moving forward. Then, it started to slow. Not because people stopped riding, but because they started choosing differently. New riders looked at a wider range of options. Different styles, different priorities, different ideas of what mattered on the road. The assumption that everyone would eventually move in the same direction didn't hold the same weight anymore. You could see it in parking lots, on highways, at meetups. More variety, less uniformity. That wasn't necessarily a problem, but it meant the pipeline feeding into one specific brand wasn't as steady as it used to be. Growth depended on new riders stepping in, and fewer of them were following that same route. What used to feel automatic start here and there became less certain. Riders still respected the history, still recognized the presence, but they didn't all see it as the final step. That change didn't erase the past, but it shifted the future. With fewer new riders moving in that direction, the brand began leaning harder on something it had always counted on. Loyalty ran thin. The riders who had already made that move stayed. They didn't walk away. They kept riding, kept maintaining their bikes, kept showing up to the same places. That consistency held everything together for a while. You saw the same machines on the road year after year, still running, still cared for. That wasn't unusual. What changed was where the growth came from. Instead of new riders adding to the mix, it was the same group sustaining what was already there. Loyalty carried weight, but it also has limits. It can maintain, but it doesn't always expand. Without a steady flow of new riders stepping in, momentum starts to level out. Not collapse, not disappear, just flatten. Respect didn't fade. People still recognized what those bikes represented, still understood their place. That part remained intact. What shifted was the movement forward. It slowed, became more gradual, less noticeable in day-to-day riding. When a brand relies on the same base to keep things moving, it tells you something about where things stand. The foundation is still there, but the direction isn't as clear as it once was. That's where the focus shifts from what changed to what it all actually meant in the first place. It wasn't just the bikes. It's easy to point at the machines and say that's where it all came from. The shape, the sound, the way they rode. Those things mattered. They still do. But they weren't carrying the whole weight by themselves. Something bigger was happening around them at the same time. And that's what gave everything its force. Look at the timing. Roads were open. Long-distance riding was part of how people spent their time. And the idea of freedom on two wheels carried real meaning. You didn't need to explain why you were out there. People understood it. That kind of shared understanding doesn't show up in every era. Culture lined up with it too. Movies, music, and everyday conversations all pointed in the same direction. You'd hear the same themes, repeated in different places, and they all connected back to the same image. That consistency built something stronger than just brand recognition. It built expectation. Mindset played its part as well. Riders approached things differently. There was patience in how people bought, maintained, and used their bikes. You didn't rush through it. You stayed with it. That approach gave the machines time to become something more than transportation. Put all of that together, and it makes sense why it worked the way it did. The bikes fit the moment. And the moment supported the bikes. Take any one of those pieces away, and the outcome changes. That kind of alignment doesn't happen often, and when it does, it doesn't last forever. Once the pieces start moving out of sync, the feeling tied to them starts shifting too. The badge faded. There was a time when what you rode said almost everything about how you approached riding. The badge carried weight on its own. You didn't need to explain your setup or your plans. People saw the bike and filled in the rest without asking questions. Over time, that changed. Riders started focusing more on how they used their bikes rather than what name sat on the tank. Distance, comfort, handling, and personal preference moved closer to the center. The brand still mattered, but it stopped being the only thing that defined the experience. You could see it in conversations. Instead of leading with what they rode, people talked about where they had been and what worked for them on the road. The emphasis shifted from identity to function, from recognition to experience. That doesn't erase what came before, but it changes how it's measured. Ownership became more flexible. You didn't have to follow a single path to feel like you belonged on the road. Different setups, different choices, different priorities all started fitting into the same space. That variety opened things up in ways that hadn't been common before. That shift isn't always obvious when you look at it directly. It shows up in smaller ways, in how people talk, ride, and decide what matters most to them. Give it enough time, and the difference becomes something you notice without needing to point it out. The road got quiet. You don't always recognize the change when it happens. It shows up in moments that feel familiar at first, then slightly off when you think about them later. You pull up to a light, roll to a stop, and something feels quieter than it used to. Not in sound, but in reaction. There was a time when that moment carried a certain kind of attention. People looked over, took notice, maybe held their gaze a second longer. It wasn't about approval or disapproval, it was recognition. That instant understanding of what they were seeing. That reaction isn't as consistent anymore. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it isn't. More often than not, it passes without much notice at all. The road keeps moving the same way it always has, but the response around it has shifted. It's not something you measure with numbers. It's something you feel in passing. The absence of that automatic recognition tells you more than any comparison could. It shows up in small gaps between what used to happen and what happens now. None of that makes the ride worse. The bike still runs the way it should. The road is still there. The experience is still yours. What's different is how everything around it responds, and that's where the change becomes clear. Pay attention to that difference long enough, and it starts pointing towards something deeper. The era ended. Looking back at it, it's tempting to frame everything as a peak that could be reached again with the right decisions. Build the right bikes, market them the right way, and bring it all back. That idea sounds simple, but it misses what actually made that era what it was. It wasn't just about one company doing everything right. It was about a specific moment where multiple things lined up at the same time. The machines fit the expectations, the culture reinforced the image, and the riders approached it in a way that allowed it to grow naturally. Change any one of those pieces and the outcome shifts. Adjust the timing, and the same bikes don't land the same way. Change the culture, and the meaning attached to them evolves. Shift the mindset of the riders, and the experience becomes something else entirely. Seen that way, it becomes clear. It wasn't just a brand at its highest point. It was a moment where everything aligned, and once that moment moves on, it doesn't come back in the same form again. That old Harley era was never just about chrome, noise, or a badge on the tank. It was about what the bike meant when it rolled through town and everybody understood. Today, the road is different, but the memory still matters because riders know when something real has been lost. If you remember that feeling, tell us in the comments what Harley meant to you. And if this story hit home, take a second to like the video and subscribe for more honest, no BS motorcycle stories from the garage.